And we will open it up for questions. For those of you who are joining online, please also do ask your questions. You can type them in the chat and they will be read out here in the room. But thank you to both our speakers, and can I open it up for questions? Is there, if you could just raise your hand if you have anything you'd like to start with. Yes, we'll start over here, please.
Thank you both speakers for these wonderful lectures. And my question to Professor Dilip Menon is, how would you look at the distinction between academia and the press? Between the academia and the press, especially the interface of academia with activism and journalism with activism. Like for instance, if you look at someone like Maulana Shibli Nomani, who is familiar to a contemporary audience because of the work Standing Alone in Mecca, written by Asra Nomani, and the controversy surrounding the book. So how do you look at the distinction that exists between academia and the press? And that segues into my question to Mahmood. Thank you so much for this lecture. I asked you this question before because methodologically, how do you look at the vitality of life in a provincial, princely state of Travancore and the kind of scriptural way of looking at it, which is least of all vitality? I've asked you this question before in King's College, if you remember. So, like for instance, a person who is a calligrapher would look at a boat, look at the port side of a boat and say that the port side looks like an apostrophe. So, actually, she is translating the script back into the vitality of real life. So, how do you translate this scriptural economy back into the vitality of, say, Marmukatayam, Matlini, or the political activism of Moulavi that existed? And the bugbear, the elephant in the room, of course, is Moulavi's Salafism. Would you be bold enough to call Moulavi a Salafist in today's terms? Thank you.
Could I just ask you to introduce yourself too?
My name is Umar. I'm a teacher at Government College Sirtala, Palakkad.
Thank you.
My name is Swed, and I'm a research scholar at CDS. My question is to Professor Dilip Menon. You showed a quote of Vakkom Moulavi on the reform, when he talks about what reform entails for him, and before that also, what really the problems that he saw in the Malayali society at that point of time, how different innovations had crept in and all of those things. My question is, you also quoted Iqbal, if I remember, Shikwa and Jawabi Shikwa. Now, when I think about the larger sort of the Islamic, reformists, the so-called reformists, Iqbal particularly comes to mind, and he has this one couplet in Urdu. I don't know what they understand Urdu. He says, "Gawadi humne aslab se jo miras pai thi, Suraya ne humko asman se zameen pe de mara." So basically, what it really means that most of the Islamic reformers the idea of reformation for them was to sort of go back to scriptures and, go back in time rather than come forward in certain dimensions. So then this debate currently also holds in the whole thing. So this is what I want to understand a little bit more. What was Vakkom Moulavi's take on it at that point of time? You see, there are certain things. For example, the scripture, the interpretation of the scriptures and all of those things, wherein maybe Vakkom Moulavi I really do not understand that. So what was it, on what understanding did he want to go back in time, reinterpret the religion? Did he want to go back in history and understand that what was really happening at that point of time, and what understanding, on what point of view he wanted to go forward in time? On these issues, we should look at what is the current state of the affairs and how we want to interpret it, and what affairs he wanted to go back. So this is, I want to also because the theme is around the princely states and all of those things. This is also an issue which we see in a place where I come from, Kashmir, because Islam came there through different routes, through Persia and all of those things. And at that point of time, the writings of the early people there, there's a similar theme there. Those people also talk that there are innovations and a lot of things that have crept in the society. And we have to go back and understand where they have come from. And then reformation, I don't know what that entails. Thank you very much.
There are two questions, both of them are to Dr. Kuria. So first one is, how is the usage of Arabic Malayalam different in Travancore and Malabar? Was one more supposedly secular than the other? Second question is, this is from Dr. Asha. So I'm trying to extend the debates your paper has sparked on questions of scripting, gender, reform, and Islam. Gender has mostly figured in the reformist discourses as an object of reform. How do you look at the reformist and print initiatives of women Muslim reformers like Halima Bibi?
That's excellent. Can I invite you to respond to these questions?
Sorry, so I'll try and answer these questions as Mahmood is still typing out. Thank you for the questions. With regard to the first question, the distinction, the gentleman is no longer, oh, you're here. The distinction between academic work and journalist work, and the fact that a lot of the North Indian reformers that we know work within certain traditions, like the Nadwa school, the Devband school, and so on, where there is traditions of creating scriptural authority. Right? Whereas I think with Vakkom Moulavi, what you have is an attempt at a more demotic Islam, where he doesn't see much of a distinction between a scholarly Islam and accessible Islam. So much of his journalistic work is actually about making Islam accessible, thinking about the ways in which Islam can move forward, thinking about the ways, as Mahmood has shown, how women can engage with the modern, engage with knowledge, and so on. So perhaps this distinction between the academic or the theological and the journalistic or the demotic, we probably need to think about this binary very differently. With regard to the second question, there are multiple traditions of reform, as you know. So you could, when you think about the late 19th and the early 20th century, you're thinking about the schools that emerged, like the schools that I mentioned. You also have the LA Hadith. You have multiple schools which refer to the ways of actually returning to a pure Islam, right? And of recovering what is a pure Islam, some of which require militancy, right? Some of which require merely textual amendation, some of which require a kind of engagement with religious belief that is much more porous, right? Where you have to know what it is that you have to engage with the landscape of dialogue that Islam occupies. So if we look at the late 19th century, much of the work that we have seems to think with three hermetic traditions of reform. So we talk about Raja Ram Mohan Roy, etc., etc. Then we talk about all of these schools that we've spoken about within Islam. Then you have the Christian missionaries. And the understanding here seems to be a wrong one, that these were not engaged in dialogues with each other. So I think the fact that scholars work with particular linguistic traditions has really, in some sense, narrowed our kind of inquiry, so that those who work with reform within Hinduism are not aware, don't read Arabic, for example. But there's a whole lot of secondary literature available, which shows us that the 19th century was a space of interaction, of apologetics, of creating traditions of defense, of opposition, and that any reform that emerged in the late 19th century was the result of at least a three-cornered dialogue between Hindus, Christians, and Muslims, right? And we have to move away from these merely hermetic understandings of an purely internal inquiry, which then takes Indian Islam back to the origins of Islam in West Asia, rather than a contemporary debate that is happening here and now, right? So that's a provisional answer that I would like to give, and I hope that addresses some of the questions that you've raised.
Thank you for the three questions. First to Dr. Omar. I think definitely the scriptural and lived experience and the continuum between these are very important. Definitely in the other spheres, such as matrilineal tradition, but definitely in something like, for example, in Al-Islam, what we see, when he engages with the question of script and the handwriting, over 5 issues that we have access now, throughout, it's centered on one hadith, so the scriptural dimension, whether, according to this fabricated hadith, whether the woman should be allowed or not allowed to study handwriting or writing, kayyezhuthu or kayyaksharam. So this is something that we see. The centrality of this, debates on the veracity of this hadith is something that we see throughout. So a minor issue, I wouldn't say a minor issue, but like one issue like this, interestingly centered very much on the scriptural question. Even though it was very much in his time, early 20th century issue, still he had to, but also his interlocutors had to refer back to this long tradition in order to either accept or reject either position. So that's what I would say. And this is something that we see throughout, keep coming again, especially among the reformist people. I don't know whether reformism is a abuse or or a appreciation. Yeah. On the question of Travancore, Arabic Malayalam versus, this was a question from online, right? Yeah. I look at the camera there. Yeah. So thank you for the question, and I would say it's a very interesting question, and I don't know, to be honest, to see the differences between the Arabic Malayalam in Malabar versus the Arabic Malayalam in Travancore. And this is something would be very interesting to look at. And when I started to read the different issues of Al-Islam, two texts that I immediately thought of were in Arabic Malayalam. One was on the big fight happened between two elephants of the Travancore Raja. And because of my interest in history of animals, I found it very interesting. And this is like, you could say it's a secular subject. And the other one is on a train accident, again, happened in the early 20th century in Arabic Malayalam. And this is also, you could say, a secular subject. But I think, making a distinction between secular and religious is very arbitrary, very artificial from the perspective. Even if you are talking about animal fight between the animals or, an accident of a train, it is always, garnished with a lot of religious undertones. So this is something that not only in the, in the Arabic Malayalam tradition, in the Malayalam tradition also, some of the Klipatu tradition, even if it is discussing about the fight between the wars between the Portuguese and the Dutch happened in the 1660s, it is very much in the whole Bhakti tradition. Even though the discussion is about the fight between the Portuguese and the Dutch. So religion and secular, that distinction is very arbitrary, very artificial before, let's say, before or beyond the non-European pre-mid-20th century spheres. And the last question on the woman journalist, great question. I'm aware of Halima Bibi's work, but mainly from the secondary sources like Noor Jahan and Noor, who have published a book, but also recently there was an exhibition on some of the magazines that they had edited. I haven't read them closely. It'll be very interesting to read them in conversation with Moulavi's own effort. Halima Bibi came slightly later, 2-3 decades after Vakkom Moulavi, but I'm sure, again, in Malabar, we used to have this saying in that geographically fortunate, Travancore is often geographically fortunate. Halima Bibi also comes from Tirukochi tradition, and therefore she was geographically fortunate than someone like, coming from, an editor coming from the Malabar, which was directly under the colonial regime, and therefore the discourses created by the public sphere, Podu, Jana, Samsarangal, were completely different. But still, it will be interesting to explore.
So I have two questions. Mahmood, to you, I want to bring the question of gender to the script as itself a gendering politics. So Altaf Hussain Hali, for example, says all the muhavras in Urdu are because all these dadis and nanis, you go and they know this. So there is a way in which vernacular is also seen as feminine in some of the reformist discourse. So with that knowledge, how do you think of the choice of Arabic Malayalam with reference to what you were largely talking about, the classical and the vernacular debate about Arabic? So what are ways in which Arabic Malayalam itself, that choice, might say something to his reformist project? And remember the word folk, which is also often used for women in reformist tradition. So that's just one point to sort of go further. to a larger question, which I addressed to Professor Menon. In the reformist insistence on time gone, the original, it's still a very modernist take on that. They're first talking through print, also a technology of the modern. And in terms of historicism, what I think in the reformist discourse is a militancy of the text. That is also in some way a very modernist obsession. We have much more fluid category of hadith, multiple version. So what are ways in which, instead of buying that discourse of the original, we might think of revival as others have argued, but I would love to hear your thought on not so much about time gone past, but about a futurity rather than a past. So that's just, I would love to hear your thought on that.
Do you want to? We'll take those first because I'm being held to time. So please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Razak, for such a brilliant question. I was thinking while you were asking this question, I was thinking this bit by Nawazuddin Siddiqui, the Bollywood actor, where he says about his mother, that his mother was illiterate and she couldn't, I think in an interview with BBC, saying that she couldn't read or she was illiterate. She knew only Urdu. And in Kerala, about 20 years ago, we had this 100% literacy, declaration of 100%, and the person was being declared as the final, last person to be literate, was a Muslim lady from Malabar, North Malabar. I forget her name. Aisha. Not Rabia. But they knew Arabic Malayalam for a long time, even to write and but that is not considered as literacy, in the modern discourse, modern discourse or contemporary discourses. So how about this long tradition that existed? And also interestingly, in Al-Islam itself, when he has a lot of, Moulavi has a lot of Sanskritized Malayalam, some of the readers who write to him says that not only women, even most of the men cannot understand what you are writing because of the Sanskritized Malayalam. So again, he also admits this in the first part, saying that only a Nunapaksha, like a very small minority.
Time, a relation to proximate time, a relation to distant time. Right? And what is it to engage with the project of reform where you're creating this separation with something that existed in the past, and that's both the proximate past as well as the ancient past. And the more important part of your question for me is this question about futurity. Right? So this reflections on both the proximate as well as the distant past are related to what the community is and can be. Right? So even when we think about the paper that Mahmood presented, the Sanskritization of Arabic Malayalam, right? There is a futurity that is projected where the Muslims of Travancore and the Muslims of Malabar can be in conversation with each other without dialect, right? Because if you think about Malayalam all the way from Gokarnam to Kanyakumari, Malayalam is very different. My wife and I speak very different Malayalam. I come from Palakkad, she comes from Kottayam, and that's talking about the present, right? So how do you accommodate these differences within language is also a politics of futurity, which requires a certain kind of streamlining, a certain kind of normalization, standardization, and so on. So in that sense, as much as with questions of language, as with questions of the correct future Muslim practice, I think there are questions of standardization that emerge, which then get back onto the fault lines of gender, fault lines of tradition, and so on and so forth. It's not an adequate answer, but I think this politics of time is very important. Thank you.
Invite some questions from the floor and also from those online.
But my main question to you is, I think the issue was Wahhabism, Salafism, all those terms that you have explained and how they are misinterpreted or misapplied. Do you think this has got anything to do with the whole geopolitical movements of the 80s and 90s, and in particular, the role that was played by many groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which were linked to many, religiously motivated groups with support from US as well as from Saudis and so on. And the entire confusion about what was Wahhabism, Salafism, and I have also read many things showing that Rashid Rida was the originator of Muslim Brotherhood, but all this, let's say, propaganda was being actually, popularized in the 90s and in the 2000s. So I just want you to reflect on that a bit. Is there also a link to the broader geopolitical trends?
Question sort of relates to what Dr. Bashir mentioned. It's like, I'm curious why he was identified as Wahhabi. Why and when? Since when is being identified as Wahhabi, and why this identification comes, or why is... And this article that you mentioned, Al-Isra Diniya, which he also translates into Arabic Malayalam and publishes there, and he also explains that. Yeah, very interesting article. But I wonder, who is beginning to characterize him as a Wahhabi? Is it a recent phenomenon, as Dr.
No.
Or is it something...
No, this is something very important today.
One more online.
Okay.
This is a question from Dr. Asha. Thank you for your profound observations and insights into Moulavi's lack of acceptance in the so-called secular public sphere of Kerala. Don't you think the KNM's championing of Moulavi is also to be problematized, just like all the other engagements, or insufficient engagements with him, such as the nationalist, Marxist and Sunni that you have spoken of, not because of the fundamentalist or terrorist branding or outsider perception of the organization, but because of its self-styling as the authentic voices or interpreters of Islam and Islamic reform?
Okay. I will start with
one more. Very quick from the middle.
Sorry, not a question. It's a concern about putting all the different shades of Salafism into one basket. You have different shades of it, starting from Al-Salafiyya wal Tanwiriyya, which was like an enlightened movement which originated in Egypt and had spillover all across the world. And when you come to 1950s, you have a Wahhabist Salafism, which the Saudi-educated scholars who came back. And now you have a Gulf Salafism or Neo-Salafism, what we call, which has challenged all the progressive, positions of Salafis took in the 1930s or 1940s. So it's not a question, it's a concern actually.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes if you want to give your response.
Oh, how can I do this in 5 minutes? I will start with this question of raising this, whether Nadwatul Mujahideen championing Vakkom Moulavi will be acceptable or whether it is adequate enough. I would say that I'm skeptical about the role of Nadwatul Mujahideen. Now, I told this in public. If Vakkom Moulavi had been alive in 1983, 84, 85, when this Shabano case had come, he would have been the first person to welcome it, I'm sure. Giving maintenance to a divorced wife interpreting Quran in a very positive way. What happened was that, Nadwatul Mujahideen was the first organization to oppose the Supreme Court judgment. And I criticized this in public in Calicut, in the presence of all my friends. And they all rose in revolt against me, saying that you are not a part of this journey. You are a different man and like that. I didn't mind that. What I'm saying is that Nadwatul Mujahideen is in the same boat of what others are doing it. I'm skeptical about their role. And it's not a single coherent unit now. Got dismantled into several units. So one advocating whether we have to move with the jinn, or others whether we have to be very literalist or scripturalist. I do not know whether these puritanical trends of the so-called Mujahideens are now ending up in a world of disaster. I am skeptical about their role in the long run. The second point is, both of you asked the same question about whether Vakkom Moulavi was called a Wahhabi. No, it started way back in the 1920s. I will tell you an example. When Vakkom Moulavi initiated this process of bringing together ulama from different parts of Kerala, first through Aikya Sangam and other organizations, there was a decision to form an organization of ulamas, Jamiatul Ulama, in 1924. We know the traditional ulama from North Malabar went into anger and said that, this Wahhabi has done considerable damage to the Muslim community in Kerala. Let us all unite and form another organization opposed to Jamiatul Ulama. But the same year, they had a meeting in Calicut in 1924. And in 1925, they formed literally the Samasta Kerala Jamiatul Ulama. And they're going to celebrate this 100 years of existence, referring to Wahhabi Vakkom Moulavi in a different sense, without mentioning his name. But the first use of this word had emerged in the 1920s. Obviously, because he wrote about Wahhab, he wrote about Abdu, he wrote about Ghazali, he wrote many people. And he was a person who kept open all kinds of trends in Islamic world. He didn't close. And if you read some of the issues of Muslim volume that we are editing now, the first volume has come out. Why is that he spent pages and pages for Al-Ghazali? He was not, in any sense, meaningful sense, a Salafi. Salafis cannot accept him as... no, that shows that he kept open this platform of debate and dialogues. What I'm saying is that, there was a public sphere emerging within this community, but that public sphere was considerably polluted with what we call as alternative debates generated by the traditional ulama. So his criticism of shrine worship, bid'ah, innovations, his argument for what we call as a kind of stopping of festivals and other things, that all resulted in this ulama coming together and declaring a war against Vakkom Moulavi. That happened in 100 years before. In 1925, when this Samasta was formed, I'm sure that Guria can find out the details from the books of or the Arabic text of that institutions which promoted this sort of thinking that we have to be careful about Wahhabis like that. The geopolitical question, and I said that this was not something new. It was not in the making of this Afghan crisis, during the Afghan crisis. Way back in the 1920s, these Wahhabi accusations were gaining ground, and even Rashid Rida had to face this criticism from his own colleagues that you are now becoming a Wahhabi. That was a kind of engagement that he had with his own colleagues in Egypt and elsewhere. So that was the kind of problem that he faced, and the subtle differences between Wahhabism, Salafism, and all the. Nowhere in the text of Vakkom Moulavi you will find Vakkom Moulavi claiming himself as a Wahhabi or a Salafi and like that. Rather, you have many observations opposite to that. Thank you very much.
So thank you for that wonderful presentation, Vishak and Dayal. So I have a couple of reflections and question of questions. Since we are running out of time, so I'll make it brief. So if you look at, so it's to Vishak. If you look at the first part of the presentation, in fact, he's using these terms like Muslim Dharma Palana Sangam and also Travangur Mahajana Sangam, Muslim Mahajan Sangam. So in fact, I'm thinking that he's strongly influenced by the kind of local nomenclature, which were used by his contemporary, reformers like, Narayan Guru and others, because incidentally, he was also part of nominated member of the SNDP.
Sri Narayana Dharma Paripalan Sangam, and also like Nadar Mahajana Sabha, Sangam. So in fact, what we are seeing here is a kind of a person, a dialogical reformer, who is strongly influenced by translocal, transregional, and also transcontinental kind of movements of ideas and so on and so forth. It's just a reflection on that. So then Dayal's part is actually very, very interesting because it is. So the question you ask, what is Islam for Manappadan? So of course that's a very interesting question, but my question will be how Manappadan is for Muslims today. I'm a person who is continuously kind of critiquing and criticizing the kind of things we have in 20s. So I just want you to kind of reflect on that. My question will be how far he was influenced by Gandhi and probably Vinoba Bhave's idea of spiritual village. Because I think there are a lot of closeness. Like kind of resemblance. One can see the spirituality and things like that. So of course we'll catch up later outside.
I'm just going to gather a few questions, if that's okay. So Professor Menon.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you very much for the paper. And I'd just two questions, which are more of the need for clarification and elaboration. When you speak about Manappadan as a contemporary of Vakkom Moulavi, as a disciple of Vakkom Moulavi, and so on, there are many things that Manappadan argues, as you showed, which share some terrain with Vakkom Moulavi and actually departs in very significant ways from what Vakkom Moulavi himself has argued, right? So I wanted you to think about the differences, perhaps, between the two people that you present here, so that we get a better sense of the way in which Vakkom Moulavi's ideas interacted within a larger space. The second thing is that when the point at which you ended, where there's this discussion of something that sounds very much like the post-Indian secularism after 1947, right? What he says reflects some of the views expressed in the Constitution, reflects some of the ways in which Nehru thought about modern India. So in that sense, to ask how much of his notion of people transcending their religion and moving towards a more harmonious kind of existence has its origins in the movement of independence, and how much of it goes back to some of the interaction with Vakkom Moulavi's own ideas. So thinking about the historical locations.
Thank you, Dr. Vishak and Dr. Dayal, for the careful distinction you have drawn between Vakkom Moulavi as a foundational influence on, rather than as the founder of Aikya Sangam, and for your observations on how important it is to extend the understanding of Islamic reform and of the underlying tensions. As relatively your researchers, as relatively young researchers, how do you look at the ideological self-positioning of a researcher, given the mired character of the afterlife inquiries into reform, caste, religion, and region? My question may be responded to as your methodological or perspectival suggestions or recommendations for young research scholars working on such questions.
Thanks for the question. So the first one, which Yasser was hinting at, about whether how much of it is from the larger currents of social reform during that period, whether it is SNDP or other. Of course, there is the way, not just in the ways in which it is titled, even the ways in which it's functioning, and also the larger ideals that it strives to seek for, and the organizational methods of achieving it. Of course, there are those kind of engagements. But however, we didn't want to make any larger claims about Manappadan's particular forms of engagement with Guru and others. Of course, there have been certain materials that we have found out, but then, we wanted to keep that claim separate, because otherwise we'll be just, we want to make sure that that claim actually holds true to Manappadan in terms of his engagement, rather than seeing it. Of course, it's important to see him as part of a wider current, but also, as Professor Dilip was saying, individuals need to be also seen in their own disembedded trajectories also, so that it speaks to history in a new way. So that's where we are not making any such claims as of now, but of course those currents could be seen reflected in Manappadan's activities, and also like in Vakkom Moulavi's. And regarding the spiritual and the how much of it is coming from his sort of a open-spirited inquiry into religion or what Islam is, and how much of it is coming from his larger engagement with the post-colonial state and other entities that we haven't come to a firm conclusions on whether it comes from his religious positioning or his engagement with the political. Because this, for instance, it is also significant, which I don't know how much Dayal would agree with me on this, but Manapadan writes these significant books after a particular phase in his life when his leg was amputated, and also he was going through a lot of illness because of diabetes and other stuff, and also you could read some sort of a disillusionment with other, because he's seen traversing through different bodies, like say Muslim League and then Congress, and of course Aikya Sangam is not anymore there. So I think those journeys are important also in reading not just his open-spirited inquiry into what Islam is, but also in terms of how he conceives politics itself. So I think that part requires a more kind of a hermeneutic analysis, which is not restricted to his engagement with religion or spiritual questions. But I think that kind of a hermeneutic exercise need to be expanded even to his engagement with the political. So that is something of a conversation that we are having right now, which will become more clearer as we get more materials, maybe, particularly the correspondences with Vakkom Moulavi and those kind of materials, not just the constituent council debates, not the council debates, but also the more intimate sort of materials that will speak to us more regarding this engagement is what we hope. And the last one on the self-reflexivity part, I think the ideological positioning of the researcher. Of course, it's a very complex question, particularly when you research on something related to Muslims in Kerala, because it's it's very ideologically how do I put it? Ideologically very significant and also very heated in many ways. So, but I think. And also, I personally, from my own experience, I don't think you can reach a very, a neutral position. Already you don't reach such a neutral sort of a position, whatever that neutral and objective position means. But I think these organizational debates are significant, and it is not that just because you engage with these organizational debates that some kind of a reflexivity will get lost. Rather, sometimes it helps you in making sense of it better because you have a stake in it. But then the process of detachment happens, I think, in due course. And I can't make any claim for such a detachment, even as a young researcher or whatever. But I think that process helps. And also, one way, methodologically speaking, I've also realized I started with ethnographic research, but now I've realized that I'm moving more into texts written by figures like Manapadan and others to get a larger historical perspective. So I think that is one way of arriving that methodological clarity. I think that as a anthropologist or a sociologist working with ethnography, I think that is what I can say from my own experience. That's all that I can say for now.
Hi. To respond to Yasser's question, I think I'll just clarify something. When we were mentioning Islam Dharma Palana Sangam, it was largely organization associated with Vakkom Moulavi, right? And if you look at Manapadan, Aikya Sangam remains the only organization, or there was Nishpaksha Sangam before that. There was Legislatul Islam, which was an education board. He was engaged largely. But you have a very important point that his understanding of reform was largely influenced by the wider currents of social reform. And one thing to emphasize, which I should have emphasized before, that he was a very close associate of Sahodar Nayappan, right? And there was his biography, the only reliable biography on Manapadan is written by someone called Kadiyalam Abubakar, who has done a wonderful job in documenting a very coherent account of his life. And he says, at the moment when Manapadan was taking the peasant rally from Kodungalur to Vaipin, a movement, a large group of people led by Sahodar Nayappan was greeting them at Charai. And there was and also there's a lot of agreement if you look at, and he was a contemporary of Manappadan in the Cochin State Assembly as well, right? And there was a lot of exchange between them in that sense. And more than that, Manappadan was also generous he was a landlord, and he was generous in giving land to SNDP, for instance, NSS, for instance, and even to Farooq College, right? And he was seeing education not just in terms of Muslim education, but contributing to the larger current of modern secular education. And Qadi Alam, whose biographer, says when he was writing this book and when he went to SNDP Trust or NSS, there was no official recognition, right? There was nothing that recognized Manappadan's contribution, a more material contribution to this thing. And then he has to go to the files and trace a souvenir of NSS that comes in 1960s to show them. And he was somebody who was connected to this, right? And in that sense, definitely Manappadan's idea of social reform was very much influenced, and he was in conversation with this larger currents of social reform there. And on Gandhi, something very interesting, the cover image of Manushan, the initial published one, we access to the publication that was done by Manappadan Foundation in 2003. But apparently, and Qadi Alam notes this, the cover image of Manushan was a portrait of Gandhi. But very interestingly, he does not mention Gandhi very explicitly throughout the text. But in one of his articles in Bhakshanam, the chapter on communal harmony, and he says it is weird to include a chapter on communal harmony in Bhakshanam. But he thinks both Bhakshanam, both food and communal violence are the most two-element factors of self-preservation, right? And then he does not find it's odd enough. And he says his thinking about communal harmony also emanate from the sheer act of Gandhi's assassination. And he even sometimes he mentioned organizations associated with that, RSS, and he even mentioned Godse on that. So he was responding to Gandhi, and one could see this very silent influence of Gandhi throughout his thinking, especially on decentralized polity. Not beyond that, he was not referring to Gandhi's ideas of secularism very directly. But obviously the problem with us at the moment, now none of us are trained historians, and we were already largely working on the text. So one need to look at more closely on other writings of Manappadan to understand whether he was directly speaking with this emerging idea of Indian secularism. But one thing for sure, he was very actively pursuing to have some sense of overlapping consensus between different religious ideals. And there is a moment in which he was saying he undertook a honest inquiry of what Hinduism is and what Christianity is. But he said to great extent he is incapable of understanding them beyond a point, maybe because of his training. But he was very open to that sort of, a common ground understanding of secularism, whether we call it or not. I think that was very, very immediate to his context.